For 400 years, a bishop of the English Church quietly collected rent from the one trade that same church condemned from every pulpit in the land. The place was Bankside, a strip of riverbank in medieval London. The women were known across the city as the Winchester Geese, and tonight we are going to walk the muddy lane where they lived and worked and were slowly forgotten, and uncover the cold little secret the church kept about where their bones were laid. Using AI trained on old parish maps, faded court rolls, and engravings of a riverside that no longer exists, we rebuild a London most people walk straight past today. Begin on a low grey afternoon in the year 1200, with the tide going out. The Thames at Southwark smells of river mud and tar and wood smoke, and the bell of the Priory of St. Mary Overy carries flat across the water. A young woman steps off the end of the old timber bridge with everything she owns knotted in a cloth. She has come down from the country looking for honest work, a kitchen, a laundry, a shop counter. She does not yet know that the lane she is walking into keeps a price list, and she is exactly the kind of person this story is about. To understand why she is in danger, you have to understand the river. London proper sat on the north bank, fiercely protective of its own laws and its own order. The south bank was another country. Southwark lay outside the city's reach, and the alderman who ran London had no appetite for the noise, the taverns, and the trade that always pooled wherever travellers gathered. The neatest solution medieval London ever found was to shove all of it across the water, to a place the city could pretend wasn't its own. Out of sight, out of mind, out of jurisdiction. And whoever owned that land owned a fortune. This is where the church walks in. In the 1140s, a man named Henry of Blois, brother of King Stephen and Bishop of Winchester, bought up the ground along Bankside and made it his private liberty. He was no ordinary churchman. He was one of the most powerful men in England, a kingmaker who helped put his own brother on the throne during the long civil war the chronicles simply call the Anarchy. He built himself a palace on that bank, with a great hall and gardens sloping toward the water. He built a prison too, a squat lockup the locals named the Clink, a word we still reach for, 8 centuries on, whenever we mean any jail. And within his walls, on his soil, paying rent to his officials, stood the licensed bathhouses that all of London simply called the stews. The name carries its own small lesson. The bishop's estate kept ponds where carp were fattened for the table, and those were the stew ponds. So a man saying he was off to the stews began as something perfectly innocent and curdled with a wink into something else. The houses were run by keepers known as stew holders, and the women who worked in them took their nickname from the lord of the land himself. His geese. The Winchester Geese. I still find it hard to hold both of those facts in my head at once.
Your greed will be your undoing! Cursed are the hollow coins of your trade! You have turned his house into a den of thieves!
The church that thundered against this trade on Sunday was the same church that counted its takings on Monday. There was a cold logic underneath that contradiction, and it is worth understanding. The great thinkers of the medieval church did not approve of the trade, but many argued it had to be tolerated as a kind of drain that carried away worse disorder and shielded respectable households from ruin. The most famous image came from the theologian Thomas Aquinas, who compared it to a cesspool in a palace. "Take the cesspool away," he warned, "and the whole palace fills with filth." It was not kindness, it was containment. And containment, the bishops discovered, could be taxed. The turning point came in the year 1161. King Henry II decided the old, unwritten customs of Bankside needed to be set down in hard law, and he issued a document with a magnificently dull title, the Ordinances touching the government of the stewholders in Southwark. 39 rules.
Must maintain clean lanes. Offenders shall pay a heavy fine. God save the king.
And here is the strange part. A good many of them were written to protect the women. A stewholder could not hold a woman against her will. She had to be free to come and go, in the words of the old custom, at her own liberty. He could not lend her more than a small fixed sum, the whole purpose being to stop her sliding into a debt she could never climb back out of. He could not take in a nun, and he could not take in another man's wife. On holy days, the houses closed and the women were kept off the street. They were even forbidden by one rule from pulling faces or throwing stones at anyone who walked past and declined to come in, which tells you, better than any chronicle, exactly what that lane sounded like on an ordinary evening. Whether you read those rules as genuine protection or as a landlord guarding his investment depends a great deal on how generous you are feeling. Personally, I think it was both at once, and I think pretending otherwise flattens a complicated truth. If you reckon the bishop earns a sliver of credit for rules that kept these women from being owned outright, tap that like and stand with me. If you think a man pocketing their rent had no business calling any of it kindness, the comments are right there. Go on, make the case. Here is a detail that should make you trust the paperwork a little less. The version of those ordinances that actually survives is not from 1161 at all. It is a copy made roughly 300 years later, and whoever wrote it tried to lend it authority by claiming it had been passed at a grand parliament held at Winchester in the reign of Henry II. There was no such parliament. The clerks had, shall we say, gently improved the history to suit themselves. A bishop's office quietly tidying the records in its own favour. Some things really are eternal. But strip away the bishop, the bridge, and the dull official Latin, and you are left with the only question that truly matters. Who were these women, and how did they end up on that bank? The honest answer is that medieval London gave a woman alone almost nowhere to stand. A respectable woman's security ran through a man, a father, a husband, a master who paid her wages as a servant. Pull that thread out, and she fell a very long way, very fast. The work open to her was thin and badly paid, spinning wool by hand, which is the very reason we still call an unmarried woman a spinster. Brewing small ale, washing other people's linen, service in someone else's kitchen. The roads into the city were crowded with young women come down from the villages chasing those scraps of paid work, just like the girl on the bridge, because London paid better than the fields ever could. There were far more of them arriving than there were honest places to put them. Widows fell into the trade. So did orphans, and women whose husbands had simply vanished, and servants turned out of a household with no character and no way home. I want to be careful here, because it is easy to picture some wild, reckless woman choosing recklessly. The records do not really show that. They show hunger. They show women doing the last thing left to do. The fall was rarely dramatic. More often, it was a slow arithmetic of bad weeks.
You owe for the bed and the bread I gave you.
I have no coins left.
Then you must work off the debt.
A girl arrived with no kin to vouch for her, took a bed in a lodging house she could not quite afford, borrowed a little to cover it, and woke up one morning owing more than she could ever earn scrubbing floors. Somewhere in that arithmetic, a keeper was usually waiting with an answer that sounded, at first, almost like mercy. I went looking for their names, and mostly I found silence. These were not people anyone troubled to write down. But a handful surface in the court records, and when they do, they will stay with you.
I promise you, there is honest work for you here.
There is a young woman named Joan Rawlyns, promised honest service in the city by a man she trusted. She put her confidence in him and let him lead her through the streets. And instead of a respectable household, he walked her quietly across to the stew's side, left her in a waterman's house by the water, and went straight off to strike a bargain with a keeper to set her to the trade. Watch the moment turn. She thinks she is being taken to a job. She is being handed to a lane she may never leave. There is another, named Christina Swinoe, whom a keeper called Nicholas Croke was accused of taking to the Southwark stews in the 1440s, pressing her into the work with a mixture of money and force. 2 names out of thousands, 2 women who almost slipped through the centuries without leaving even that much behind. And in case you imagine only the poorest were ever at risk, there is the case of Elizabeth Butler in 1473. She was simply visiting a friend's house in London when she met a man named Thomas Boyd. Boyd lent her money. Boyd then made certain she could not pay it back. When she was hauled before a court and admitted she had nothing, she was locked up for the debt, which was precisely what Boyd had been angling for all along. He would gladly cancel what she owed, he said, on one condition, that she come and work in his house on Bankside, alone, an arrest, a door swinging shut. That was all it took to turn a free woman into a trapped one. That, to me, is the cruelest machinery in the whole story, because it wore the face of the law. Of all 39 rules on that bank, one has lodged in my mind and refused to leave. The women were forbidden to wear an apron. An apron, the plain, everyday badge of a married housewife, the woman at her own hearth. The point seems to have been to stop the geese from passing as respectable wives in the street. Unlike some cities across the Channel, England never made these women wear a marked dress or a striped hood. The apron rule was the quiet, cruel exception. Respectability was the one costume they were not allowed to borrow. A whole life, a whole verdict hanging off a strip of cloth. I keep trying to imagine the morning a woman first folded her apron away and understood what that meant, and I cannot quite get inside it. If you can, I would honestly love to read how you picture that moment in the comments below. None of this happened in isolation. The whole South Shore had become London's escape valve, the place the city went to do what the city forbade at home. Along the same muddy stretch stood the great coaching inns where travellers gathered before the road south. One of them, the Tabard, is the very inn from which Geoffrey Chaucer set his pilgrims off toward Canterbury. There were dyers and shipwrights and rope-makers, taverns loud past midnight, bear pits, and in time the timber playhouses where a glover's son from the Midlands would make his name. Respectable London used this shore constantly and admitted to it never. The bank kept its own clock. In 1209, the first great stone London Bridge opened, a marvel crowded with houses and shops, and its own little chapel to Thomas Becket, and the city poured across it toward the South Shore in a steady stream of merchants, sailors and travellers with court business and a free evening. Demand was so heavy that a second tolerated district later opened across the river near Smithfield, on a street the maps still label Cock Lane to this day. Back on Bankside, a lane beside the houses came to be called Maiden Lane, after the women themselves, and you can still trace its ghost across the modern map of Southwark. The keepers were banned from owning boats, partly to stop them ferrying women in and out unseen, partly so they couldn't overcharge a captive customer on the fare.
Who's for the city? Choice of boat! Cross the river now! My boat is ready, take no other! Safe and swissage!
Watermen called for trade along the slippery steps. The smell of the river never left any of it. For the bishop's officials, all of this was simply a ledger. Every broken rule meant a fine, and a woman who stepped too far out of line might face a public ducking in the river as a humiliation. A woman rented her small chamber by the week, about 14 pence, and answered, like everyone on that bank, to the bishop's bailiff and his manor court. Every fine, every penalty was income. At its height, the bank held as many as 18 licensed houses, and by some counts, close to 1,000 women working them at any one time. A small town's worth of lives the city would rather not count. By the 15th century, the houses were so lucrative that the keepers grew rich enough to buy property all over Southwark, and Winchester became one of the wealthiest seats in the entire church. Sit with that for a moment. The grand stone cathedrals we still file into and photograph were paid for, in part, by the women on a bank the same church refused to so much as name. And that refusal is where the story turns cold. These women lived under the church's license. They paid the church's rent. They filled the church's coffers. But the church would not let them lie in holy ground. To be buried in a consecrated churchyard, you had to be reconciled first, to have repented and stepped away from that sinful life before the end. A woman who worked the stews to her final day was, in the eyes of the institution that had grown fat on her labor, unfit to rest among the faithful. Think about what that meant to people who believed with their whole hearts in the life to come. It was a second loss laid on top of the first. A separate plot was set aside instead, far from the parish church, on ground the church would never bless. We know of it because a careful old historian named John Stow, writing his great survey of London in 1598, set down what the elders of the city had told him, that these single women were denied the rights of the church, and that a piece of ground had been appointed for them well away from sacred soil. He called it the single woman's churchyard. No headstones anyone preserved, no tombs, only earth and quiet, and a long, slow forgetting. The bank itself did not last forever. In 1546, in one of the final acts of his reign, Henry VIII ordered the houses of Bankside shut for good. The trade did not vanish, it never does. It simply scattered and fell silent. The grand liberty faded. The taverns and the theatres rose and fell, and the lane where the geese had lived sank over the centuries into one of the poorest, harshest corners of the entire city. The forgotten plot kept gathering the forgotten. By the 1700s, it had become a burial ground for the very poorest of the parish, for those who came out of the workhouse, for those found in the river, for anyone whose family could not pay for a grave, so many of them heartbreakingly young. By the time it was finally closed, in 1853, it was so densely filled that the authorities declared it, in the language of the day, completely overcharged with the lost. Something close to 15,000 people are believed to lie in that one small patch of Southwark, and the city simply built over them and carried on. Until the 1990s, when engineers cutting a new electricity station for the underground broke ground on Redcross Way and began lifting out bones. Archaeologists from the Museum of London were handed only a few short weeks. They recovered 148 of the dead and estimated that even this was barely 1 in 100 of all those packed beneath. The ground had finally spoken, and what it said was that the city's poorest had been folded into the earth here, layer upon layer, and left. Here, I have to be straight with you. The 148 that were lifted out belonged to the ground's last, hardest chapter, the Paupers' years. Whether the medieval geese themselves lie somewhere in the deeper, older layers, no spade has ever proven. What we know for certain is only what Stow recorded, that a churchyard for the single women existed on this stretch apart. The ground kept their memory long after it lost their names. What happened next is the part I love. The forgotten dead of Bankside got their name back. It began, of all ways, with a writer named John Constable, who in 1996 felt the story arrive almost like a visitation. A voice he came to call the Goose, leading him to the gates of a graveyard he had never heard of. He turned it into a cycle of plays that were later performed inside Shakespeare's Globe and Southwark Cathedral. The the very institutions of a city that had once looked away. Local people refused to let the place be paved over and lost a second time. They hung the rusted iron gates with ribbons and feathers and small tokens, one for each of the forgotten, and gave the ground a name that finally fit: the outcast dead. A plaque went up. A garden of remembrance grew. And to this day, on the 23rd of every month, people still gather at those gates in the heart of London to read the old story aloud and honour the women the city once threw away. They do it for the outcast of every century, they say, the dead and the living both. After 800 years, somebody finally came back for them. The girl who stepped off the bridge with her life knotted in a cloth had no idea anyone ever would. You can still stand inside this story if you want to. The great rose window of the Bishop's palace survives, set into a wall on a street still named Clink Street, a stone's throw from where the houses stood. The lane the city called Cock Lane is still printed on the London map. Cross the water on a summer evening, and you will find the rebuilt globe glowing on the very shore the city once disowned. And that small garden on Redcross Way sits open to the sky, a soft green square in a forest of glass towers, quietly holding the memory of the Winchester Geese. We are the team behind Mystique History, and these are exactly the people we built this channel to remember, the ones the chronicles left out in the margins. If their story moved something in you, follow along and stay close, and tell us which forgotten soul you think the world still owes a second look. We read every single one. They were licensed and they were taxed, blessed for their coin and barred from the blessing. And in the end, it was not a bishop, but a fistful of ribbons on a rusted gate that finally called the geese home.